Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. There are just 3 things I ask of you, if appropriate to you and your experience. Please subscribe, please click on the like button, and please share this program link with any family members, friends, or colleagues who might be interested or benefit from the content. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Sandra Scofield. She's a native Texan who abandoned the Lone Star State. Not too many people abandon Lone Star State, but she spent the last 40 years in Oregon and Montana. You know what that brings to mind for me? People like writers like Jim Harrison, Thomas McGuane, Ken Kesey. She taught in the public schools and at the university level. Since 2006, she has been on the faculty of the Solstice MFA low residency program at Lasell University. Not LaSalle, but Lasell University. She has taught at the Iowa Summer Writing Festival since 1993. That impressive credential there. And she is the author of 7 novels, a memoir, a book of essays about family, a book of stories, and 2 craft books for writers. We're going to be focusing on those craft books in good degree. She was also a finalist for the National Book Award, which is a major deal, among other honors. She's also an avid painter, a solitary traveler, a closet poet. What does it mean to be a closet poet? I know what a solitary traveler is. That's a gutsy thing to be a solitary traveler. These days, she divides her time between Missoula, Montana, and Portland, Oregon, 2 great cities. And we're going to talk to Sandra about the last draft and the first draft and a whole bunch of other things. Sandra Scofield, welcome to Novelist Spotlight.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. And, you know, that last draft is something to talk about for sure, because when you write a book, when you write a novel, I think that one of the methods of procrastination for many people is that they never feel like they're done. They got to keep working on it. And it's one of those things you learn over time that if you keep going back to a paragraph, a chapter, a section, you can always rewrite it. You can always find little tweaks, and you tweak it one way and then you tweak it back the way it was
and then
before.
You never get to the last draft.
And then you never get to the last draft, so you never have to face rejection. So get a backbone. Is that part of your book on the last draft? Is part of it that you have to have the backbone?
I hadn't really thought of it quite that way, because what I'm encouraging people to do is to get the story down on paper. And then you have an actual object. You have something to think about and talk about and describe. And I have a student right now, a master's student, who's wonderfully talented, wonderful story. And he's just in agony all the time about this page and that page. I told him, come back to me.
What's the agony? What is the agony? Is it just that I know I can do better, or it doesn't feel right? Can you kind of characterize the agony?
I think it's if this page isn't right, then the next page won't be right either, and I won't ever get there. But
so he feels like every domino has to fall in order and in perfect order. He's not one to move ahead and then go back and retrofit. By the way, before you say anything more, Sandra, I want our readers to know that the book that you wrote is called The Last Draft, and it's subtitled A Novelist's Guide to Revision. Oh. Very relevant for all of us.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
You. No, I thank you for that. I get wonderful feedback about it. And one of the things people say to me is that the voice of the book is friendly and helpful, which is what I want. But there's no way to tell someone how to write that first draft. Although I'm thinking about writing a book about it. Everyone has a way of doing it. But if what you do when you do have a story down is to go back and fuss with the language, you're not going to improve it very much, because
Sandra, I always think of the first draft as something that calls the herd, because I say everybody, so many people believe they have a book in them until they sit down to write it and they find out
right.
how difficult it is and they drop it. So most people never actually really get past, really even write a first draft. So when it comes to the last draft, which the people, after the herd has been culled, now people have written a full manuscript. They're trying to get that last draft done. Talk about some of the highlights in your book. What are some of the pieces of advice? And I know you work directly with people on their manuscripts as
Right.
well. We'll talk about that a little bit. So, what does your book say that are some of the major considerations or major highlights that they have to take into account?
Well, this is going to sound strange, but the biggest problem, and the one that will push you the furthest when you've solved it, is to be able to actually say what the book is about. What is this story about? And when you ask someone that, they want to give you a plot. They want to start telling you what happens. But I think it's like you've got to stand way back and say, what does this story add up to? I recently finished a novel, and I say that what it's about is how, after the death of a child, everyone in an extended family has to figure out how to live the rest of their life.
So it's almost like an elevator pitch. You have to get it right down
Exactly.
to a nut.
You do.
And
And
if you have to really get it down to one sentence for it to be a true, hey, what's this book about? Well, talk a little bit about. So let's say what you just said was, and that's tragic, a death of a child, and everybody has to think about how they're going to live the rest of their life. So how does that inform the final draft?
well, because what I encourage people to do is to divide that into two parts, which is what actually happens physically, what the events are, but also a pattern, or you could even say a plot of what the emotional steps are in getting through those events. So if in this case, first it's a young mother who dies, and her husband and children move in with his parents. So that's the setup. And after that, it's a whole sequence of things about getting the kids into school, and the one who obviously just isn't making it there, while meanwhile the husband isn't getting better. But the parents, I'm talking about his parents, the grandparents, this puts pressure on them too, and it puts pressure on their relationship. They disagree about what to do about the girl that's having trouble. They disagree about their son, who is a very deep marijuana smoker, and that's how he's staying.
But how does that solidify the final draft?
Because everything, as you read a chapter, you say, how does this illustrate my aboutness? If I'm writing about how every member of the family has to figure out how to live the rest of his life, what question is there in this, and is it answered, or is it complicated?
So it's almost like staying in character or staying on point. For instance, if you're coaching somebody on their manuscript, you might find a section where you say, how does this further the story, or
Exactly.
how is this relevant to what your theme is?
Exactly. And the other thing which feeds right into that, I know I never heard anybody else say this, but I think that one of the best tools you have as a writer is summary. And if you can learn to compress what you're writing, then you can judge what it is that you expand. And so that's one of the first things I have my students do when they have a draft, is to go through and write a summary, a really short one, a paragraph of every chapter. And then we sit down and read that sequence of paragraphs to see if that sounds like a flowing story. And
that's interesting.
You'd be amazed how that immediately tells you, I'm skipping something here.
That's a great piece of advice. But not only skipping something, but also just understanding that by summarizing the paragraph, you are making it very clear to yourself whether or not you are staying in character or staying, being consistent with the theme.
Right.
I would think.
And and all of these things are saying to the writer, step away from the sentence, step away from the line on the page, and treat the story as an entity, a thing that you have created that has contours and personality and problems, and figure out what they are, instead of trying to fix the pages. Now, when I say that, I have to back up and say, if I have one great concern about the status of writing in America, it's the sentence.
At sentence level, people are not constructing sentences optimally, it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, I think we've gotten awfully casual about language, and students really resist that. But like my current student, this morning I was just writing a final evaluation to him, and one of the things I said to him was, my biggest, if you go away with only one recommendation, it is that you get a list of the books put out by New York Review Books and start reading, because they haven't published anything that isn't really well written. Just pick anything.
New York Review of Books, not to be confused with the New York Times Book Review.
No, right. The publishers. That's my.
Now, I would say, I would add to what you just said, and I want you to pass judgment on this for me. I would say, if you're trying to really understand how to write great sentences, two authors I would point people to are James Salter, the late great James Salter, and also Don DeLillo.
Oh, well, I think those are wonderful. That wouldn't have been, Don DeLillo wouldn't have come to mind, but I love Don DeLillo. That's great. Can I just say something? It's almost silly, but I just was thinking about it. James Salter wrote me a note to say how much he liked Gringa when it was published. And
now that's one of your novels, right?
That was my first novel. Just fell into it,
And he wrote you a note?
Yes.
Wow, what a compliment that is.
It just meant everything to me, because it was a tiny little press, and nothing would happen, and it just fell off the edge of the earth. And I said, if James Salter thinks I wrote a sentence right, I'm going to keep going.
Oh, absolutely. And any of you listeners who are not familiar with James Salter, I highly recommend, I recommend starting with, and I think I've said this on the podcast before, he wrote a book called Light Years about a married couple that I think they're at age 40, and she decides she wants a different life. And it is a beautifully written and just heartrending piece of work. And he's written, of course, other things that are beautifully written as well. That's my favorite of his. But what a great, at a sentence level, James Salter is very hard to beat.
That's right.
What a compliment to you, Sandra, that he has dropped you a note about your first novel.
I'm laughing to myself about it, but who have I ever got to say that to? The other writer that I pick up all the time, I have her collected stories, is Mavis Gallant, the Canadian short story writer, for sentences. But I mean, it's basically, I'm saying you have to go back 40 years to be confident that the writing is going to be really solid. Now, I don't mean to say there's not wonderful writers. There are terrific writers. I mean,
but we've gotten too casual, too cavalier, too sloppy. Which actually begs another question that I had pending, and that is this.
it almost, I wonder, do you find that some writers just say it's done too early, that they are a little too slapdash and they've decided I'm done with this novel, and you look at it and say that's not a final draft. You have not met the mark yet.
Yes, except that if I see a novel in which I think it's weak at the sentence level, there's a lot to be done before you worry about the book. That's that's a terrible situation and to be in, and frankly, I'm not in it very often. I mean, I teach an MFA program, and they come to us with talent and a pretty good command of the language. But there is a real resistance to the idea that you can work with the sentences. And
Why is that? I mean, that seems so obvious to me that, I mean, those are all the component parts of what makes a story, and also really what drives readership. I mean, you have to have a certain velocity, you have to have a certain lyricism. I would imagine when you're writing fiction. Well, do you think, is that laziness or what?
Well, no, I just think it's a reaction to the way the world is being run. Young people are growing up on TikTok and I don't know what else, and things are short and crisp and fast, and they go by you. It's very different from sitting down with something of 300 pages that is so well written that you read it slowly. And
It's time consuming. It takes a great deal of time. Now, let me ask you this: like, you see a manuscript, it's not strong at the sentence level. It also is wobbly in terms of the story itself. The theme it does not have full continuity. Where do you work with? Do you work with that person simultaneously at the sentence level and also the story level, or do you get the story or the theme completely solid state and then say, okay, let's go to work on these sentences and really make them sing?
well, it sort of depends, because sometimes if the language is weak, the story isn't there. But if I'm coaching a novel, I feel like I almost have a contractual obligation to focus on the development of the storyline, to help that person complete, something that is coherent and a narrative that moves and arrives at something, and that this issue of language, it sounds funny to say it's separate, but you kind of can't do both things at the same time. I'm trying to think. Someone was asked, "How do you know a student has talent?" And I'm wondering if it's Janet. I just can't remember who said this, but basically, I remember that the person said, "I know a student has talent when they have a strong sense of story and can talk about story, whether it's something they've read or something that they've written." In other words, I mean, a story with a capital S is something that kind of has a weight to it and a velocity, but it's also someone who is, wants to be a writer. If they ask me, do I have talent? I would never say no, but if you don't have good language, boy, you got a long way to go. And
Yeah.
and my husband was a high school teacher. He's been retired 25 years now, but he taught when teachers still assigned things and brought them home at night. I mean, that's my memory of 30 years, is night after night after night at the table with student papers, and English teachers, high school teachers have at least 100 students or more, but that kind of devotion to, like, picking some issues and trying to help them at that time. Well, now I'm sure there are some teachers like that, but they have such big loads. They have such expectations that are other than that actual teaching. They're probably writing most things on the internet. I mean, on the computer, their evaluations and reports and so forth. And I just wonder that, like, really at that really basic level, if a lot of people are missing out. But you can get better. You can get better. There's just wonderful books out about. I mean, I have a whole shelf at home, about improving your sentence, and just books about the joy of sentences. I mean, just look up books on sentences.
Or books about scenes, because you have a book that predates the last draft called The Scene Book, and it's subtitled A Primer for the Fiction Writer. I said the primer. Do you say primer? I hear people say, I say primer.
I say primer.
Primer. Okay, a primer for the fiction writer. Talk about The Scene Book. I'm assuming, based on the title, that you're talking about creating scenes.
Absolutely, because once again, something for students to learn is that narrative is composed of chunks of different kind of prose, but basically what carries a novel is scene, something happening on the page, you might say, in front of you. What makes a novel great, I think, is the narrative voice, whether it's the introspection or the commentary or the description. But a novel can't fly if it doesn't have event, and if that's not expressed in really vivid scenes. And you would think that everybody grew up on movies would have a sense of that, but I find it's very helpful for them to have kind of a little nugget of advice about it, and Lord help me, I probably can't remember my own advice, but that a scene has to have an event, that it has to have, some kind of stream of feeling in it, or even that it has to have a beginning and an end, that I can go to the page and say, this is where the scene starts, this is where the scene ends. Because when you go away from, I'd say, 90% of readers, when they go away from a novel they liked, that's what they're remembering, is the scene.
The scene and the various scenes. I remember characters, but you mentioned strong narrative voice, and that's really ascendant today. There's an awful lot of books out there now that are being written in first person that are kind of like quasi memoirs.
Exactly.
And people like a really strong, they want a voice that they like to listen to, and that takes them places, and they want to go there with that voice. And that seems to be really what publishers are looking for these days, are very much books along those lines. And that begs a question that I want to ask you about. When I go to a bookstore and I open a book and I just thumb through it, a book I know nothing about, I don't know the author, and I just see tons and tons of dialogue.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
I tend to just put it back on the shelf because I want the author to tell the story.
Me too.
And one example of that, an extreme example of that, was Frederick Forsyth, who quoted almost nobody. He just told that whole story. It's just like, sit down, I'm going to tell you a story. It's about espionage, and it's the Day of the Jackal or whatever it is. And he was the voice, and he didn't let anybody else in. What about that? I think there's such a tendency to let the characters tell the story and to overquote everybody.
Yeah. I mean, but there is a taste for it. There definitely is an audience that wants to identify with character and sort of take a ride with them, which is a lot different from wanting to sink into a narrative. I mean, I think there's...
Now, by contrast, I will say this, having said that, I'm a big Philip Roth fan, and he has these long stretches of these motor-mouthed Jewish men who just go on, just blabbing away and telling people the way things are. And it works for him. It works for him, and I can't exactly say why, but he'll have those long stretches of dialogue.
But that was his talent. And it's rare.
It was his talent. It was, and not even dialogue; it was monologue in a lot of cases. But anyway, what the scene, when you talk about scenes, I mean, you would, I think, agree that typically a chapter is made of scenes.
Right.
Or do you consider a chapter a single scene or vignette?
No. What I call commercial fiction um, is usually built entirely of scenes. And, but like you said, if it's in the first person, it's somebody telling the scene, and it often is just one event. But the novels that are more substantive, I think, chapter tends to be comprised of a sequence, and 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 around that sequence you have copious sort of the narrative voice, which comes out in the interiority of the characters. It comes out in the description, and even comes out in the comment. There's such a thing as the narrator commenting on what is going on. And a lot of this is just a matter of taste, and I'm expressing my own. And I try to embrace whatever is whatever it is about my students that turns them on. I want to help them do well at what they choose to do. And maybe I'm just, I'm getting old. What I like goes back to the 50s. But when I was driving home from Portland the other day, I started listening to The Matrix. To Matrix.
Oh yeah,
Lauren.
the movie, The
No,
Matrix.
no. The book. Have I got the?
Who's the author of The Matrix?
What is it? Now never mind. Lauren Groff's book, isn't it called Matrix? Anyway, Lauren
I'm not
Groff.
sure. Go ahead.
It's the story of a young woman in the Middle Ages who her family doesn't have anything for her. They don't have any money for a dowry, so they send her off to a decrepit convent as the prioress. She's going to go run a
convent?
A convent of nuns. And here she is, a young woman from a family basically cast out.
I'm not familiar with that book. Do you recommend it?
Oh, yeah, it's wonderful. I hope it's called Matrix. But it's Lauren Groff for sure. And it's gotten wonderful reviews. She's good.
It's funny that you bring up The Matrix, and I confused it with the movie, because I was going to ask you, when it comes to scene writing, do you think there's a benefit for writers to watch movies and kind of pay strict attention to the scenes in a movie? It's just because a movie's made up of scenes, really. It's scene to scene to scene. Is there something to be, obviously you'd have to pick good movies, something like a Casablanca or The Shawshank Redemption or what have you. Is there some benefit in doing that for the writer who's trying to better understand scenes?
One of the things that I've done in workshops and that I encourage students to do is to take it could be a TV episode too, but to take something that you like and find a scene that you really like and figure out where does it start and where does it end. Watch it a bunch of times and then try to write it.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I think that's you see how it starts and how it ends, and kind of like what happens in between there. I think they can be very informative for a writer. And obviously, when you're writing, you're going to be more expansive than that. But let me ask you about expansiveness, because one of the things that came to mind while you were talking is I like that whole idea that you have of summarizing each paragraph so that you understand really where you're going and if you're sticking with the theme. But do you find that novelists tend to do a lot of overwriting? Or do they underwrite?
That's entirely, it's the whole range. I would say very seldom do I see underwriting. I almost always see more. Yeah, because when somebody wants to write a novel, they've got a lot in. They're carrying a lot to the task, and a certain kind of joy and commitment, and so they've got a lot to bring to it. if they're stingy writers, they're going to have a hard time. And I generally I don't see that.
I just see I've read a lot of books that get over, even Tom Wolfe. I mean, the great Tom Wolfe, whose novels I loved, he would tend to overwrite.
In our MFA program, Solstice, which is just wonderful for me to be involved with students. But what I'm seeing is, I would say the majority of our MFA students write genre fiction, and good for them. Not only do they write genre fiction, they publish it themselves and sell it. And that.
But why do you say good for them?
Well, because they're not going to suffer from angst. They're not going to be languishing, looking for
trying to write literature.
Right. I mean,
because literature is so incredibly difficult. Well, not just incredibly difficult, but it's harder to find an audience for it. Correct?
Is. And high quality fantasy, it's a demanding genre, and if you can do that, you can find readers. It's as simple as that. And what satisfaction there is in knowing that's
and having readership.
Book.
Yeah, but you're not a genre writer, right?
Oh, no,
you write general fiction,
right?
And looking back, would you have decided I'm going to write romances or detective novels or sci-fi?
I couldn't have. Listen, I wrote a book.
You would have gotten bored. Writing the same thing, right?
I just don't think I could have done it. That I could have figured it out. That I don't have that talent. But I wrote a novel during the pandemic, and I think it's the best thing I've ever written. And my agent hasn't been able to sell it.
Really?
Yeah, so
why not? I mean, what's the theme? What's the premise?
It's the one I'm talking about. The family where the young mother.
Oh, wow!
And the central consciousness of the novel is the 60-year-old grandmother, and a lot of it. I mean, there's two grandmothers, and they're sort of butting heads over what to do about poor Junie, who can't get over her mother's death. And
now you were a finalist for the National Book Award. Which novel was that?
That was Beyond Deserving, and I want to point out that was when they had 4 finalists, not 16.
Oh, wow! So it was very select.
Beyond Deserving, and the thing that surprised me about this current novel, Little Ships Not Floating, is that it's that Beyond Deserving was a story about family, very much a story about family, and not a remarkable family, an ordinary American domestic novel, and really this one is too. And I'm just walking down the stairs to read you when it says on Beyond Deserving. I've got my little thing that they gave me about the keenly observed story, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, they said, she holds the reader in the grip of the commonplace rendered fresh, a fascinating revelation of contemporary American life. But I don't think that's what they want anymore, the publishers.
Now, that was, what was that from? Who wrote that?
The committee.
That's a National Book Award committee.
Yeah. So
wow.
That was their, it was longer, but that's their statement.
You have two huge things to your credit: being a finalist for the National Book Award and getting a personal note from James Salter.
They're just about equal, I'll tell you.
And then on top of that, you teach at the Iowa.
No, I have to correct you. I'm so sorry. It's the summer festival. It's not the MFA.
Summer festival. Okay.
Yes,
well, nonetheless.
No, I'm not. I've never been in that club. But let me tell you a little bit about the festival just briefly.
Sure.
Because it has, I started, I think it was like their 3rd year or something or maybe even just their 2nd year, and been with them through the whole thing. And the thing is big out. I mean, there's just really lots of people every summer. And they're all really, most of them are people who either wouldn't or couldn't get into something like an MFA program, or they're older and they finally, are retiring and have time to write. With some young people, like the woman who wrote Time Traveler's Wife came through that summer program.
Right.
And somebody, the teacher said, wow, let's work on this. But the wonderful thing about that program was that what I've seen, I mean, I've worked with hundreds of people now, that everybody has a story and they just are dying to tell it. And when they come together like that, great friendships are made. Some things get published, some things get self-published, but just to be in a community where everybody's interested in what you're interested in and where they are interested in hearing what you have to say, it's just been wonderful. But I don't know if they're going to, surely they'll pick it up again. Not this summer, but.
I want you to know that I've looked it up, and Matrix is the novel written by Lauren Groff, Groff, Lauren Groff, and Matrix. And I've just added it to my list, my reading list. So thank you for that, Sandra. Now, let me ask you about this memoir you wrote. It's titled Occasions of Sin. What sins did you commit that you had to write about? Is this a confessional?
No, it's about my relationship with my mother.
Was that a tortured relationship or was it a positive one?
Well, it was short, was the main problem. My mother died when I was 15.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And she was so full of things she wanted to accomplish and do. But, she sort of pushed me into the world. And the occasion of sin is, that's a term in Catholicism, at least, and it just refers to putting yourself into a situation where you're more likely to do something wrong. And I felt, and that's what I
like dancing leads to sex.
Yeah,
the Catholics don't really believe that, but like
right,
the Baptist, but I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay.
What I think, I mean, what that book is really about is coming of age as a young woman with a very conflicted feeling about your body, about what you're supposed to do with it and what it is and what you can be proud of and what you're ashamed of and how you're going to use it. And then you lose your mother right at the very point when you have your first boyfriend. And
right.
And at that point, I had been in Catholic convent schools my entire.
So the confliction had to do with Catholicism.
Yeah. And
it's okay.
I'm writing about nuns again. I'm writing new.
Yeah, I know. I was just going to ask you, the one that you've just written that you're trying to get sold. It sounds like this is an echo of your own experience.
Well, and the strange thing is that never crossed my mind until after I'd done it. Someone said to me once, who had read all my novels, she said, Sandra, it strikes me in your books that nobody ever owns their home. And I said, well, I guess that tells you something about the status of the people I write about.
Never owns their home?
Right. That it's people.
So in other words, these are not people of means.
Exactly.
These are, okay, these are people who live hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck.
That's not true of the new novel. In fact, one of the big shocks in the family is when the woman who is the voice, the 60-year-old, realizes that because both she and her husband have worked and he inherited money and they've led a very modest life and everything's been invested, they're actually millionaires. I mean, you can accrue $1 million if you just are lucky enough to have a kind of settled middle-class life.
Mm-hmm. Or disciplined enough to make sure that you put it away. You have to, just be consistently putting it away, and it compounds and so on.
But I don't know. I think, I think that a lot of what certainly what drove that story was that I had a cousin whose wife died, and my aunt raised his kids, and that's been in my mind for decades now. But I didn't. It wasn't their story that I told. And when you finish a novel, you always find out you were writing something you didn't even know. And I think a lot of what I was writing about in that book is the woman's only 60 and I'm like 78. If you're a person, if you're a person with sort of intellectual interests or any kind of interest, at some point you think, how much of what I want to do can I get done? And in her case, she still got a lot of time, and it hadn't really dawned on her that she could change her life. She could be, she wants to be more intellectual. She decides to go, she hasn't gone to college. And at 60, she decides to go to college. For me, I think I'm still writing. I'm passionate about writing, but I'm also passionate about painting. And
yeah, you're an avid painter in your solitary travel. Let's talk about solitary travel. Why do you do now solitary travel? Meaning you go solo?
By myself,
is that right?
In big jaunts. Yeah, for quite a long time I've been. Well, I used to go to Mexico, but that's really a long time ago. I wouldn't go to Mexico now. But it started when I was just out of college. I spent half a year in Mexico, and then I went to Europe or whatever. But in my marriage, now, both my husband's retired and we're comfortable, and he doesn't. He has made a couple of trips with me to Italy, and he's going to go to France with me in the fall. But what I like to do is to go by myself with like something in mind that I want to see or do. And then the rest of the time I'm going to walk and find things to do. And I don't,
Interesting.
I don't go to one of my girlfriends who's an intrepid traveler. She's been all over the world. And she says, why do you keep going back to London and Paris and, Copenhagen? I said, how could you ever exhaust them? And I'm going to London Sunday, and I love that when I get off the train at Paddington Station, I know exactly where I'm going to stay. I know where I like to eat, but then I will go to somewhere that I haven't been before too. And
That's really interesting. That whole, and there was an article, it was the New York Times or Wall Street Journal had an article about the number of women, lots of women travel solo these days.
Yeah.
They enjoy it. But I like your methodology. You decide I'm going to go specifically to see this and then spend the rest of my time wandering around, seeing what I find and enjoying the city.
I'll give you a perfect example. One of the first times I went to London, I went to the British Library, which I always drop in the British Library because you get to go and see, the actual manuscripts of wonderful writers and so forth. But anyway, afterwards it was a beautiful day. And so I decided, instead of, walking back in some logical way, that I would go into the park, Regent's Park, because there's a canal that goes all the way. There's a canal that goes all the way through London, and just following that canal, little by little, I'm getting along every bit of it. But just because I was looking for the canal, I discovered the church that is well known because it has a cemetery that was designed by Thomas Hardy. And now I'd love to go. When I say cemetery, I'll try to tell this quickly, but it's so intriguing. He was actually an architect, and when the railroad was coming through London for the first time, they had to tear up land, and they had to tear up this huge cemetery that went back hundreds of years. And he was tasked with what to do with the bodies and the headstones and everything. So they dug a mass grave. They put all the bones and what was remained in that, and then he took headstones and he just layered them like cake slices all around a big tree, spreading out these circles.
Wow.
And so I call it they refer to it as the hardy tree. And there's just something, he's one of my favorite writers in the world. And there's just something about standing at that tree that makes me feel a part of all that history and of his history. And so that's an example of one of the things I like to go to every time.
So talk about your painting. Speaking of architecture, speaking of the arts, writing, of course, being an art. Are you oil? Are you watercolor? Pardon me?
It's I paint in oil, although I do work with gouache, which is like thick watercolor, sometimes to do studies with, and I would like that. But yeah.
And what about your subject matter?
Well, when I started, I did all this on my own. When I started out, I painted a banana, and then I added an apple to that and sort of moved along. But what really turns me on is landscape. Unfortunately, not Montana landscape very much, although my husband and I are just planning to go north of here where I like the landscape because it's not like craggy. It has a kind of undulation to the hills and so forth. So I would say it's primarily landscape, and I think that's from having grown up in West Texas, where in a sense there's no landscape. There's just.
Did you grow up in the Panhandle? Amarillo?
No, South
Canyon.
Well, first of all, I was born in Wichita Falls, which is just across from Oklahoma, and then spent my teen years in Odessa, which is
Odessa, yeah.
But that's where all my family is or was, and so I've gone back over and over and over, and that the immensity of the sky, which is also wonderful here, and the land. So I'm not like when I say I paint landscape, I'm not doing realistic things with trees and water. It tends to be kind of semi-abstract, lots of hills.
So true or false, when you paint, your mind starts telling you, I should be writing.
No.
What am I doing painting? I should be writing. Do you divide your time up?
Yes.
Do you?
And that's
the
wonderful thing about painting. It's the one thing I do that I don't think about. Now, I've been.
What do you mean when you're applying it?
Right.
You don't think about it. You just okay.
Right.
Don't you wish writing could work that way?
Yes. And I think for a lot of people,
that you just channel it.
I think that is how some people. I think a lot of people do write like that, actually. But so I've had no formal education as a painter, but I would say that my knowledge of art history is graduate level. My daughter went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, which is the premier art school of the country, and I kind of followed behind her, picking up everything that she and she and I have been, to so many museums together, and my best friend is a painter, Janice Gabriel, and between the two of them, it's just like I learned so much that when I really just sort of secretly decided, well, I'm going to do it myself, it just kind of it emerged pretty well. And then I've gone to a few workshops. I went to some workshops. Generally, they don't. The one person, Nancy Bush, who's a wonderful landscape painter in Texas, she was important to me. But where I really blossomed was when I started going to workshops in England, because the
painting workshops.
Yes, when I discovered British modernism, it was like coming home. It's like an entirely different aesthetic. And that's what I'm going to go to a 3-day painting workshop in Cornwall, St. Ives next week.
Oh,
And
Wow,
I
that
just
sounds
love
really nice.
it. In fact, I'm thinking about joining. They have a program where you come every 8 weeks for a year, 6 times. I'm thinking of doing that.
Hmm.
Um,
Now you're a closet poet as well. What makes you a closet poet? Do you
you
just do
mean,
that for yourself
yeah,
and you don't look to publish it?
no, yeah, it's that it's really helpful to me to have that without people seeing it as a way to think things
Takes
through.
all the pressure off, right? I mean, don't you sometimes tell students, maybe, I mean, I've heard of people just saying that I write for myself, I don't think about the audience, it takes all the pressure off, and I
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
you
See,
know,
that's why I love painting is because one, it doesn't have words, and two, nobody is judging it. Now, my daughter is pressing me. She insists that when she comes to visit this summer, she's going to get me on Instagram. So I'll let you know
mm,
if she does.
yeah. Yeah.
But
Well, I will follow you on Instagram because
it would be
when
fun.
this podcast publishes, I'm going to be promoting it through social media, and
That's
your
great.
face will be there on Instagram. I'll be promoting it, and I'll be tagging you on it. And I think our listeners should know that Sandra Scofield, our guest here, she does manuscript evaluations and line editing. That line editing, you heard her talking about
The
the
sentences.
sentence level writing and the importance of that, and she also occasionally does developmental editing. So which she mentioned in passing during our conversation. If you want to reach out to her, and I'm going to put this in the episode notes as well,
Okay.
the you can write to Sandra at writingmentor at yahoo.com, and I'll also put her web address in there, so
Great.
you can learn more about
And
Sandra.
I I think I mentioned to you before that I do have, I have worked with a couple of very accomplished writers, but in general, I write with it turns because it's all by word of mouth. It turns out that I seem to always be working with a first time novelist who has no formal background in studying writing. And I really like that. I really enjoy that kind of coaching. But I also have, good skills.
No background in writing, but they're articulate.
Right.
They
And they
they
have a
maybe
story.
have been an avid reader. They know good writing when they see it, and now they're trying to turn it out
Yeah, I always
themselves.
ask them, "What have you read lately, and what books do you love?" Because it gives me an idea. But I just love to see a story blossom. I'm just a great believer in self expression. I think
Yes.
it beats the heck out of bars and whatever. But
Yeah, and the thing is that when you write, you can live 1,000 lives as a writer. You can be. I remember Thomas. Well, he wrote under the name Thomas Altman. He wrote under several, but his name was Campbell Black. He's
mm,
since passed away, but I knew him years ago when I lived in Sedona, Arizona, and he used to say that the thing about writing, he said, "I've been a pregnant woman. I've been a spy.
yeah,
I've,
yeah,
I've been this. I've been that."
yeah,
He says, "I've been so many things because I'm a writer." And it's said. Is it what Game of Thrones is?
yeah.
What's his name? George R. R.
I can't remember, but I know.
I forget his name right now, but he says, the man who doesn't read lives one life. The person who reads lives 1,000 lives in one.
Yeah,
And it's the same with writing. You can be 1,000 different people. It's part of what's heady about writing. It's part of what's exhilarating. And I think people who don't write don't realize that when you create characters, that these characters become very real. They become very real. And I liken it to something like a hallucination. A
it
lot
is.
of
That's a
people
good
think
term.
a
Yeah,
dream
yeah,
or a hallucination isn't real, but that's nonsense. A hallucination or a dream is as real as anything else. James Salter is the one, and I loved when he said this. He says, as you get older, you realize that life is really a dream,
yeah,
because when you look back at your life, the past people you were with and experiences, they're dreamlike. they're very much dreamlike.
Yeah.
And there's a real power in that.
Well, I
You know
mean,
what?
there's the power of knowing that, I don't know how to put this. Like, I don't worry about dying because I don't have to answer for anything then. So I might as well not answer for it now either. I'm just going to do as long as.
Are you sure about that? You're a Catholic girl. You're going to have a lot of explaining to do, maybe.
Yes. Well, I'll probably tackle that in this current book, but it's just, you got to live in the now. You've got to be in that dream.
And express, emote, express. That's what we're put here to do. Let me ask you this in closing. Talk about your work ethic as a writer, not necessarily ethic and style. I mean, are you a person who gets up in the morning and you log your 4 hours of writing?
No.
How does it all happen?
No, for one thing, by this stage of life, so much happens in my head that I don't write down for a long time before I do write it. But I would say it's more for a long time that it's towards the end of the day that I try to pull together the random thoughts that I've had and do something coherent on the page. And that's usually notes rather than actual text. But when I'm working on a novel, I work on it every day till it's done. And
So you're a note taker in the developmental stage of a potential novel. You're taking lots of notes, and then it's incubating in your head as well.
Exactly.
And then when it matures and when it's ready to actually go.
Well, it's like you can't help yourself anymore. You have to write it. But
So when you're in that phase where you're okay, it's time. I have to give birth to this thing. What's your writing regimen like?
I just get up and have breakfast and start writing till I'm tired. Um,
So you put in as much effort and time as until you basically peter out, and
to write.
then the next day you go back to add
This
it.
most recent novel I wrote over the course. I started it about 5 days after they declared that we were having a pandemic, and every day I worked on it for a year. Period.
Mm, mm.
And now I'm working on something else. But I've also had fun going through the boxes of things started that I don't even remember. I think I'm even going to put those together into something like false.
Well, Sandra Scofield, I'm glad I found you because it's such a pleasure to talk to somebody who is a veteran and an inveterate writer. You really can tell the difference when you're conversing with them. And this has been I think it's been really valuable to our listeners, really valuable to me.
I hope
And
so.
it's just been a great conversation with you. I thank you for taking the time, and I wish you
Thank
best of
you.
luck on getting that book published. That
Yeah.
that one that you're trying to get published now. It sounds like a great story, and I
Probably
love
a
how it.
small press. It'll be out. I promise. It'll be out within the year.
Well, and I love that the fact that it's an echo from early in life for you, from your mom's demise when you were only 15 years old. It sounds very much like there's that echo,
Yeah.
and it's almost like this. You're coming full circle.
Yeah.
Not that you're anywhere near done, but I mean, done with your life and your creating of literature, but you get the idea. This has been fun, Sandra, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Mike. I enjoyed it.